Hi. Welcome back to Psychology 2010, that is to say Psychology is a Human Science here at the University of West Georgia. In our last three videos, what we did was we successfully got through the Getting Started material for this class, and the central theme of the Getting Started material had to do with drawing a distinction between psychology according to the paradigm of the natural sciences as opposed to psychology according to the paradigm of the human sciences. Today, in this video, this will be the first video in a series about humanistic psychology, which, if you watched the last video, you already know is going to be a particular example, in fact, a historically and traditionally significant example, especially with respect to the University of West Georgia's psychology department of psychology as a human science. First question in your notes. So what is humanistic psychology? Well, it's going to be one of these post-positivistic modes of psychology, using some of your vocabulary from the last video. Humanistic psychology questions the mainstream convention of adopting a narrowly natural science approach to psychology. Hopefully that's fairly straightforward for you at this point, because once again, it's more or less directly out of the previous video. Instead, humanistic psychology offers a vision oriented around exploring the nature of human experience. Okay, so experience is going to be a big deal, especially with respect to questions of growth, transcendence, and the fulfillment of our deepest potential as human beings. So there's going to be very much a big emphasis on this whole business of potential and conceiving of growth and development in terms of the fulfillment of our deeper potentials as human beings. So let's trace out a little bit of the historical lineage of humanistic psychology so you understand where it came from. So first of all, humanistic psychology is a distinctly American mode of psychology, so it's one of ours, and it arose in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Probably the center point for its origin would be the 1960s, and you have to remember a little bit about what was going on historically in the United States during the 1960s. So we had the advent of the hippie movement then, and the hippie movement was basically about how a lot of young adults especially were questioning the orthodoxies that were handed to them from the previous generations. Orthodoxies concerning, I guess, the style of music that is permissible, the states of consciousness, try to be delicate about this, that are permissible, the kind of sexual experiences that are permissible, the style of dress that is permissible. So in the 1960s, probably for the first time in the United States since probably like the early 19th century, we saw males having long hair, and it wasn't due to the coronavirus, as is the case today. So my hair is getting a little longish, just show you what it's looking like. So I wear these hats to try to keep it under control, but it was a matter of style. It was a matter of rebelling against the orthodoxies of the time that seemed pretty constrictive and were worthy of questioning, would be a short way of putting it. Well, actually, it turned out that the same kind of thing was happening with respect to psychology at the time. Well, what was the psychology of the time like in the United States? Well, for the most part, it was dominated by two schools of psychological thought. And the first of those would be psychoanalysis. Okay, so I think it was 2 videos ago we did a review of, or maybe it was 3 videos ago, the schools of psychological thought that ultimately constitute psychology as a whole, and one of those had to do with psychoanalysis. And remember, the thing that we said about psychoanalysis is that all forms of psychoanalysis deal in one way or another, and there's a bunch of different ways of doing this, with the idea of the unconscious, this part of ourselves that we repress, that is actually the largest part of the human psyche, and that exerts powerful influence over all of the psychological terrain of our lives. So why would people during the 1960s, I'm going to use that as sort of the focal target, although humanistic psychology was really ramping up during the 1950s. Why would they be questioning that in much the same way that the hippies of the 1960s were questioning a lot of the prevailing orthodoxies of our culture at the time? Well, the thing about psychoanalysis is that there's a pretty heavy, recurrent, and insistent focus on psychopathology and how to deal with various forms of psychological disturbance and disorders and so on. And it's not as though that in itself is a problem. It's obviously not a problem. Obviously, we need to find ways of helping people move through different forms of psychological suffering. Let's put it that way. That's obviously a desideratum. That's a fancy word for something that's desirable. Okay, so obviously it's that way. But the problem, here's the problem, is that in its inordinate focus on all of that, psychoanalysis left out a large fraction of life that, as people who are interested in psychology, we might well be interested in. Okay, so what segments of life did that leave out? Well, it left out all of the positive side of life. You know, there's more to life than just sort of working through your problems so you can rise up to the level of the average or the acceptable or something like that. There's also the other part of life that has to do with rising above the average and hopefully into the higher reaches of what human existence can be, you know. So the thing about psychoanalysis' insistence on the psychopathological and dealing with the psychopathological is that it leaves a lot of life unexamined. Well, what might some of those higher reaches be? Well, you know, sometimes you might have important spiritual experiences, for instance, or you might have epiphanies, or you might have what Abraham Maslow calls peak experiences, sort of like the most intense, overwhelming experiences of oneness with the cosmos, communion with God, something of that order, that are at sort of the upper echelons of what we can experience as human beings. Okay, so the principle of exclusion is the problem. Okay, so that was the first one, psychoanalysis. Second one, second school of psychological thought that was predominant at the time of humanistic psychology's advent was behaviorism. Okay, so, and here we have to talk about it in terms of old school behaviorism. So what was old school behaviorism about? Well, we went over this also, I think, in the one, either video number 1 or video number 2 for this class, and it has to do with trying to be true as possible to that animating spirit of natural science type inquiry, which would say that the only thing you can really reason about in any kind of reliable way is stuff that you can directly observe in the world, and the only thing you can directly observe in the world about human beings is how they behave in a physical sense. Okay, so I think in that video where I mentioned behaviorism earlier, I kind of gave the example that, you know, you can observe someone having an emotion behaviorally, like you can observe someone crying, right? But that's different from observing the sadness itself, the emotion of sadness itself, let's say. Or you can observe someone who displays depressive symptoms, but that's different from observing the depression itself. Okay, so the sadness itself or the depression itself or the happiness itself, none of these things are directly observable. So once again, there's a principle of exclusion at play. So in behaviorism's insistence on focusing only on observable behaviors, what that excludes is a lot of stuff you would probably be naturally interested in if you're into psychology, which would be all of the elements of our subjective experience, because none of that is actually directly observable. And lo and behold, as people during the 1960s were seeing the shortcomings of psychoanalysis with respect to not addressing sort of the higher echelons of human existence, as it were, and seeing the shortcomings also of behaviorism, you know, namely that it doesn't address or take seriously elements of our subjective experience, lo and behold, that provided fertile ground for a movement like humanistic psychology, which was going to question the orthodoxies that were structuring psychology at the time in much the same way that the hippies of the 1960s were questioning the orthodoxies that were running throughout the social terrain at the time. Okay, so humanistic psychology then arose as the so-called third force psychology. So whenever you see that phrase, third force psychology, that's just a coded way of talking about humanistic psychology. So what were the first two forces? Psychoanalysis and behaviorism. I'm so glad you already figured that out. That was so cool of you. All right, so Let's see what I have next in your notes about this. Of course, as a mode of post-positivistic psychology, humanistic psychology represents an attempt to resist seeing psychology as a way of reducing the complexity of human existence to some sequence of scientific formulae or equations. Consequently, humanistic psychology is very much a non-reductionistic mode of psychology. Okay, so humanistic psychology is going to be resisting the kind of tendency that runs throughout a lot of natural science psychology to try to reduce what we are to something simpler, like trying to reduce what we are to just part of what we are, for instance. And you can kind of see this in biological psychology, that if for instance, you can see it in other modes of psychology too, that, if you're researching the brain and neurotransmission and things like that, it can be an awful temptation to think that once you happen upon a certain set of findings, let's say with respect to neurotransmission, that you have the ultimate answer to life, the universe, and everything, and that ultimately everything psychological you can boil down to the processes of neurotransmission and more generally how your brain is working. That everything psychological becomes explicable in those terms and comprehensible in those terms, and the fallacy of that is that, certain parts of our lives are comprehensible in those terms, but not all of our lives. Okay, and part of the reason is because, and maybe you've noticed this in accounts of biological psychology, that there's always a kind of disconnect between the story about, let's say, neurotransmission and the quality of life as you actually experience it. So they'll give you an account of, let's say, depression in terms of lower than average levels of serotonin. That's a particular neurotransmitter activity, and that you need higher levels of serotonin activity, so they might prescribe for you an SSRI, that's a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor technically, which will, if it inhibits reuptake, what that means is that there's more serotonin in the synaptic gaps to heighten that kind of activity between those neurons that are associated with that. So, great, wonderful, but that doesn't yet explain why depression feels like depression to you as you experience it. There's kind of a gap in the biochemical and neurological account, and then on the other hand, the experiential account. And yes, it is important to understand the biochemical and neurological element of our lives, but it's also important to understand the experiential element of our lives. But the reason why I'm bringing all this up is to get at the idea of reductionism. So humanistic psychology is going to be trying to resist that temptation to say, we got the answer to life, the universe, and everything, and by the way, it's about how your brain works in terms of neurotransmission. From a humanistic psychological point of view, basically, life is not reducible. Oh, let's say that again, because it's sort of a dramatic moment. Your life is not actually reducible. It's not reducible to part of what you are. It's not reducible to any one sort of relatively simple set of factors or components or anything like that. You are what you are as a totality of many different factors and many different dimensions, all coming together and coinciding and intersecting to produce life as you know it. So if you really want to understand what you're about psychologically as a human being, you have to understand things in that kind of way. Okay, we're about to give a special word. Here comes a vocabulary word. Oh my God, yeah, vocabulary word. I can't wait to get a new vocabulary word. I know how you students think, always panting and slavering like wild wolves for new vocabulary words. Okay, so here it is. We need to adopt a holistic approach. Okay, so here's the weirdness of that word is that there are two spellings. 90+% of the time they spell it Holistic, and then about 10% of the time they put a W in front of the word. So I gave you both spellings in your notes. So the question at this point is the obvious one. What is holism? Because humanistic psychology is not going to be taking a reductionistic approach. It's going to be taking a holistic approach using some of your new vocabulary words. Okay, so holism. Okay, so holism, or a holistic approach, is going to have two basic elements to it. One in a series, collect them all, trade them with friends. Basic elements to it. Okay, so the first one you can probably infer from what we've already said so far in this lecture, that a holistic approach is going to try to view us, human beings, in terms of everything that we are, without reducing us to one part of what we are, or reducing us to something simpler than what we actually are. Okay, so it's going to be viewing human beings in terms of everything that we are. Okay, that's the first sort of element to it. Let's see how I said it in your notes. Okay, it's an attempt to honor and embrace the totality of our lives. And I gave you a bunch of examples in your notes to try to, not because this is a comprehensive list, but I want to evoke a sense for what holism is really about. So our lives would include things like our physical bodies. That is sort of the locus of biological psychology. Our minds, our emotions, our spirituality. Oh, interesting. Your spirituality is included in a holistic approach, rather than saying something like, well, that's just your brain working in a certain way. Our sociality, our connection to other human beings, our values, our behaviors, which behaviorists would study, our religious convictions. Oh, your sense of religion, or your the experience of maybe prayer or connection with God's included? Yeah. Okay. Our ethics, our desires, our histories, our dreams, our nightmares, even the parts of us that seem ugly or repulsive, the parts of us that we want to sort of get rid of or wish they weren't there, that we deny, ignore, etc. The point is to understand all of it if we can. All of it. All of what we are as human beings at the same time, without diminishing or demoting any aspect of what we are. Okay, so that's the first part. Here comes the second part. Second part is first part, to understand all of what we are. Second part, to understand all of what we are in the many interrelated contexts that we inevitably inhabit. All right, because we're not just sort of molecules floating in a vacuum. Right? Like, our lives play out with respect to our connection to the world and our embeddedness in the world, right? And the world, if you think about it, has many different kind of contexts. I listed some of them there. Like, your family is a kind of context that you live in. The circle of your friends is a kind of context. The community in which you live in, participation in national and even world affairs is a kind of context. Even very large things like your embeddedness within the universe itself, or that you are a participant in life. Okay, like really large contexts that probably most of the time you don't even think about. Probably most of the time you just sort of take it for granted or don't even notice. Well, from a holistic point of view, those kinds of things are important too. The fact that you are a citizen of the universe, you are a child of the cosmos, as it were, is important to your psychological constitution in a way, all right? Because it's part of the context, the set of inter-nested contexts that you inevitably inhabit. Okay, so once again, this question arises with respect to these large overarching contexts. How are you relating to life? Oh, wait a minute. Weren't we just hearing about this in one of the previous videos? Yeah, you have an incredibly retentive memory. I am freaking impressed. Impressed AF, if you'll permit me a slight vulgarity. So, once again, how are you personally relating to life becomes an important question for your development as a psychologist. More importantly, as your development as a human being. Okay, like, how are you relating to life? This is not a bad question to ask, even though your culture doesn't make it particularly inviting for you to ask it. What your culture tells you is, as long as you can get to the next weekend, you're good to go. Well, maybe there's more to life than getting to the next weekend. All right, everyone wants to get to the next weekend, by the way. So, that's not up for dispute. The question is, what else is going on? Maybe like how you relate to life, how you relate to your existential condition, how you relate to the cosmos, how you relate to other human beings, and so on, is an important question. So, an implication of this emphasis on context is that humanistic psychology involves understanding both, important word, the individual side of life and the social side of life. They're both important. Okay, as well as our relation to the larger natural world. Okay, they're all parts of the equation. We need to take these things seriously, that you are an individual, at the same time you are undeniably a social being. At the same time, you are undeniably a participant in the dynamics of ultimately universal transcendence. It seems so obvious, but the thing is, it's not that obvious within the purview of mainstream psychology. Okay, so let's see where we are in your notes. Maybe this is enough for this video. Should we sort of trying to strategize slightly? Okay, let's make this the end of this video, and probably we'll do 2 more videos, and they'll be relatively short ones, because I think it's better for you to have smaller bites. They're easily digestible that way. So have a great day. Have a wonderful day. Wonder about taking a holistic approach, not just to psychology, but perhaps even to your life itself, where you resist the temptation to reduce the complexity and the intensity and the brilliance of life as you know it to something smaller than what it actually is. And in the process, you begin to open the wings of your soul to the wide and wild sky of reality itself. Just a thought. Have a good one.